that. Okay. So let's get started, everyone. Appreciate everybody's patience as I kind of sort through my infancy of understanding technology. Today's webinar topic is designing diversion and intake in your shelter. But first, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. So for me, I am in London, Ontario, and I acknowledge that I'm situated on the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Lenape and the Attawandaron peoples. I honor and respect the history and languages and culture of the diverse Indigenous people who call this territory home. And I'm grateful to have the opportunity to do this work and live and play on this land. But I also recognize too that CSTN is a national network. So from coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. And we recognize the historic and ongoing impacts of colonization. And we're committed to decolonization of our systems and ongoing reconciliation, guided in our work by the United Nations, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the TRC calls to action, the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls calls to justice, and the principles of empowerment and self-determination. I also just want to make a special note too that in last month's webinar, there was some examples how our presenter Tessa from Siloam Mission in Winnipeg talked a little bit about how emergency shelters could do some work around decolonizing in their day-to-day work by changing and reviewing policies and procedures in their shelters that can hopefully decolonize some day-to-day practices for shelter operators. So if you haven't seen last month's webinar, I really encourage you to watch the recording. There's some really cool practical lessons that were shared from Tessa about introduction of new practices into their shelter that allow for greater service for their guests. A few housekeeping items. One is please mute your computer just so we can avoid some background noise and some chatter. I'm asking that all attendees can ask questions at any time in the Q&A. There is a Q&A box that's available. We will be answering questions at the end of the presentation, so there is time carved out for that, and hopefully we'll be able to get through everyone's questions. But if there are any questions that go unanswered, obviously you can always email me following the session with specific questions that didn't get answered, and I can do some reach out to our presenters following the session to get some answers to those. As far as the webinar itself, today's webinar is being recorded. So if you don't want to appear in the recording, please turn off your cameras. But the recording will be shared in a follow-up email to all the attendees, as well as it will be hosted on the CSTN website, as will be a PDF of today's slide deck. So again, you can find that resource and a bunch of other stuff at the transformshelter.ca website. So our outline for today, the introduction, housekeeping we're working through. We're going to talk a little bit about the mission of CSTN and the goal of these webinar series. Our presentation is going to be on the topic that's going to include diversion, eviction prevention, and homelessness prevention, and what's kind of the difference between those things. We'll spend a little bit of time talking about the what, why, and how of diversion, and then also of intake for your shelter. And then at the end, after questions, we'll look at the agenda upcoming for these sessions. And then I'll do a quick plug on a research and evaluation project that we are doing with the University of Calgary with Dr. Katrina Mullaney. So I know that the relaunch of CSTN is a relatively new thing, and so CSTN might be a very new thing to some recent folks that have become members. So I just want to do a quick reminder around how CSTN can assist you. One is that we host these webinars monthly that I will be a part of, as we'll have guest presenters in a lot of these webinars. That hopefully you will see as inspirational, and I've done some really cool change work in their shelters to have improved outcomes. We can also assist by some tools that we have available, and I just want to highlight one specifically as the self-assessment tool that you can find under the resource tab at the CSTN website, specifically on how to do a self-assessment to assess your progress in becoming a housing focused and low barrier shelter. So if you're thinking about making that change of moving towards being a housing focused and low barrier shelter, this self-assessment is good to use for like baseline data at the beginning of your change process, but then also to use periodically throughout that change process to see the progress that you're making. And as I mentioned earlier, we do have a resource tab that has a lot of tools that are hosted on the website, from how to respond to encampments to practices of things that you can introduce into your shelter. So all kinds of stuff. That's examples from different communities across Canada and the United States. And then the goal of our webinar series, one is, and first and foremost, is to really kind of be able to strengthen your shelter services to hopefully improve your housing outcomes for your guests that are staying in your shelter. The other is that we hope that the goals that you develop on becoming a housing focused shelter will align with the goals of the broader community that you find yourself situated in. I know that sometimes emergency shelters kind of feel like they're standing alone, separate from the broader system of housing and homelessness. So this is an opportunity through the teachings in these webinars is to find ways to align practices in your shelter with those practices that you're seeing in the broader community that you are living in and working in. And then the other is that we are here as members because we see ourselves as creating a national movement of shelters that provide low barrier and housing focused services. So the webinar series is really about trying to continue to champion that movement and learn together and grow together. So that hopefully, as a country and shelter operators across the country, we can establish really clear service expectations for our shelter guests when they come to seek shelter. It also allows for us to develop some consistency around how we deliver services so that no matter where someone goes looking for shelter, whether it's in Windsor, Ontario or St. John, New Brunswick, there's some consistency around the level and type of support that they will receive when they're there. So our mission at CSTN is we're a network of homeless shelter leaders and organizations committed to becoming housing focused, because we see emergency shelters as really being the front door for a lot of people who are experiencing homelessness. And so that makes us well positioned to be a big engine for driving an end to homelessness. So introduction to our presenters today that will be joining us. First, I'd like to welcome Mike Lethby. Mike was born and raised in Niagara, Ontario, and worked in the local auto sector before graduating Brock University with an honors BA in political science and history. Mike also holds a master's degree in political science from the University of Western Ontario. He is currently the executive director of the Niagara Resource Service for Youth, aka the RAFT, a not-for-profit agency in the Niagara region working with youth and their families. Mike is an innovative leader working to create a systemic approach to addressing youth issues and youth homelessness in Niagara. He is a principal actor in moving the region's youth service model from a reactive institutional crisis model to a preventative community model. Mike has overseen the development and implementation of Youth Reconnect, which is a school-based homelessness prevention service, and Eternal Roots, a kinship finding and connection program, as well as launching Niagara's Housing First for Youth response. Currently, he is overseeing a shelter diversion program, which is showing great promise in reducing homelessness, and managing a social enterprise, Fresh Paint, in collaboration with TradeWorks to help youth build skills and earn income in the trades. Also joining us today is Amanda Brierly. Amanda graduated from the Child and Youth Worker program from St. Lawrence College in 2000. She worked in group homes and behavioral therapy settings until she found her calling with home-based housing in 2007. Since being with Homebase, situated in Kingston, Amanda has worked a variety of roles and in 2016 designed and implemented the street outreach program as a pilot project. In 2019, Amanda moved to the shelter system, and in 2021 became the manager of shelter services and street outreach. She is passionate about ending homelessness and believes the housing approach works. So welcome, Mike and Amanda. Lovely to have you here. Really appreciate you committing the time today to join us. So we'll move right into a few things. If you've been in previous sessions, you would have seen this slide where we're talking about transforming shelters and that it is a big paradigm shift. But, want to acknowledge that this work is incredibly hard and acknowledge that the work that emergency shelters do is often life-saving for a lot of people and is very essential in our communities while we're waiting for people to be rehoused. I think I mentioned earlier too that it can feel oftentimes when you're working in emergency shelters that you feel underappreciated and you feel a great deal of pressure. Oftentimes that pressure coming as a result of the failures or limitations of other sectors and systems. And so I think in the past I've mentioned things like, shelters can often feel like the only response when someone gets evicted, they go to shelter. Getting released from custody with no fixed address, go to shelter. Discharged from hospital with no fixed address, go to shelter, and so on and so on. And so this has created a tremendous amount of pressure and fatigue on our shelters and shelter workers. But as hard as it feels to do transformation work, because you're already working so hard, we know that we can't keep doing it the same way. Because this image on the left is, I think, what we've done historically for a very long time, is feeling like a lot of our energy, resources, and attention go into emergency shelters providing an emergency response, like beds and food, with not much opportunity to pay attention to prevention and diversion strategies, and not a whole lot of attention potentially and resources committed in the shelter to assisting people with rapid exit from the shelter. So we want to create a radical transformation, and the coaching content will heavily focus on that transformation that hopefully will start to look like shelters making the change, becoming housing focused will feel a little bit more like this. With our resources and our staff internally in our shelters, we can start to make changes that gives increased emphasis and focus on prevention and diversion, which we're going to talk a lot about today. That's today's topic. Still seeing the really critical need to do intake and have emergency response. And of course, those basic needs to be met, but still also then creating a lot of focus as well around now that short-term stabilization has been created, opportunities for rapid rehousing or rapid positive exit into permanent housing. So it is going to require to think for emergency shelter providers around allocating resources a little bit differently, or shifting staffing roles and responsibilities a bit. And so we're here to kind of figure that out together on that journey of doing it. Some of you have already started doing that. Some of you are brand new to this. And so this is why I kind of share this image here around kind of where are you at in that journey, right? So through this series, I'll be asking you, how you're feeling and where you find yourself in this transformational change process. So many of you may still feel like you're on the left side of the slide, feeling like there's a need for change because what you're currently doing isn't resulting in people getting housed from shelter, for whatever reason that might be. There could be lots of different feelings like confusion, like I don't know what these changes will be and how it will impact me. You could also have feelings of anxiety and loss because potentially you've been doing this work in a very specific way for a very long time. And to change your way that you do this work can make you feel anxious, or a loss of the relationships that you've had with some long-term shelter residents, right? So Grant has been here so long and I like seeing Grant in the shelter and he's a stabilizing presence. And so loss of him might be a loss of that relationship. Or lost because I don't know if this changes the type of work I signed up to do when I started working in emergency shelters, right? So housing focused, interventions is not necessarily the type of work that I was thinking that I was going to be doing when I started working in shelters. But hopefully, kind of as we move through these webinars together, you'll move through these feelings and be able to start to create some clarity around how to do this transformation work, and around developing a new vision for your shelter and a new direction for a new shelter model. So I've been surveying people as we've been kind of going through our webinars, encouraging people to follow the link to a survey that is anonymous. And it just asks one really simple question: where are you in your transformational change? And to please select one, right? So you recognize the need for change, or you're still in that confusion state, or you're feeling anxiety or loss or clarity, or you're already at the point where you're integrating and restructuring in response to change. So Chantel has the link to the survey. She will add it into the chat box, and you can follow that link and just take a quick moment to answer the question. And it's really important for me to kind of get the survey responses to this question, because it helps me to understand where people are at in the journey, and it helps me then modify some of the webinars to make sure that the content is hopefully at the right stage for where people are at. So am I moving ahead too quickly, or am I not moving ahead quickly enough? It also helps me to see over time, is the percentage of attendees making that movement where they're slowly moving from early stages to then greater clarity and integration and restructuring. So are these webinars having the intended effect of helping people move through the process? So this is just the proposed topics for some upcoming webinars. As you see, we've already done a couple, but our next one will be on self-directed and staff-involved rapid resolution. Normally, these webinars take place on the last Wednesday of each month, but our next one is going to be a week early because October 30th is the same day as when the national conference is occurring. So I didn't want that to be a conflict for people. So we're just moving it up a week earlier than usual, but typically our webinars are on the last Wednesday of each month. So for our topic today, we're talking about diversion and intake in your shelter. And so let's start with a few assumptions when we're talking about diversion. One is, can we all agree that people are generally resilient and we can empower them to maximize their resiliency? And like, people aren't just born with or without resilience. And if you happen to be born without it, you can build it. It's not something that you can't build, quite the opposite, you can build it. The second assumption is people can participate in problem solving and mediation when it comes to solving their housing crisis. So we can build that resilience with people through practice, right? The more we do this work with them, the greater their resiliency will build up as they practice some of these strategies more and more, encouraging them to be directly involved in the problem solving and mediation processes will hopefully helps them resolve their homelessness, will build up those problem solving and mediation skills. The third assumption is that shelter services should only be used by people that have no safe and appropriate alternatives. So we agree that the limited shelter services we have available in our community are used, those spaces are used by those who don't have any safe and suitable alternatives available to them, right? So we want to ensure that it's used for those that truly have no alternatives. And we can only know that by exploring diversion with them. And the last assumption is that we as professionals have the necessary skills to use diversion in our shelters consistently. So using those professional skills and practicing diversion in our work, and I know we have the ability to do lots of great work at diverting from shelter and do lots of creative problem solving. We know this because we've seen shelters do it for years now. But we also see that shelters are really great at diverting people when shelters are full, when there are no spaces available. So we need to apply that same commitment to problem solving and creative solutions, whether our shelters are full or not. And so I borrowed this image with permission from org code, where we talk about diversion as really being that service that stems the inflow for our emergency shelters. So if we start with the idea of, like, in our metaphor, using a bathtub, where the metaphorical bathtub and the water that our metaphorical bathtub is people experience, or it's our shelter, and the water is people kind of entering our shelter. It's about then three things. One is we want to, the goal is to lessen the amount of water in the tub. And there's two ways of us being able to do that. One is by slowing down the inflow, so slowing down the amount of water that does come into the tub in the first place. So in this metaphor, the number of people coming into our shelter. And then the other way is by draining the water out of the tub, so creating outflow opportunity. And in our lives, that's about moving people out of shelter through positive outflow into permanent housing. And so these two inflow and outflow pieces are really, really critical. And so in a later webinar session, we're going to talk about maximizing our outflow from shelter. So for today, we're really going to be focusing on stemming the inflow. So how are we slowing down the amount of water coming into our bathtub so that we don't put so much pressure on the bathtub itself and solely on draining the water. But so I like that metaphor to kind of help guide us when we think about diversion. So diversion, what is it, right? It's
Grant, if you can hear me, you've become muted.
all right, sorry about that. I don't know how that happened. What was the last thing that folks heard?
The very beginning of the slide.
Oh, okay, great. So I'll restart then. So diversion, what is it? It's a strategy used by homeless services to prevent individuals and families from unnecessarily entering emergency shelters by helping them identify and secure immediate safe housing alternatives. So it's a service that is person-centered, meaning that it is something that the person experiencing homelessness or the housing crisis is directly involved in the problem solving, with the direct help of a professional support person, seeking out those safe options to shelter that can include tapping into and understanding their individual social capital, right? So example are things like friends, family members, and other external resources that we may uncover. And then for the system, it's about diverting away from entering shelter, which can often be overcrowded if it can be avoided. But for the individual, it's about finding potentially a more suitable or a sustainable option, but also with the intended aim of kind of avoiding people being unsheltered and trying to make their homelessness as brief as possible and avoid unnecessary entrance whenever it's safe and appropriate. And you'll hear me use those terms again, safe and appropriate, throughout diversion. We never want to think that diversion is about diverting someone to something that puts them at risk. So how it works, it is a problem-solving conversation that will attempt to kind of understand what caused the person's housing crisis. So what caused them to show up seeking shelter in the first place. It's about exploring kind of some immediate solutions. So you're not solving everything, you're just solving the immediate presenting issue by, understanding what formal or informal resources might assist to create a short-term solution. And so informal resources can include things that I mentioned already, like social capital, which can be thought of as the potential ability to obtain the resources or favors or information from one's personal connections, right? Like friends or family, and other natural supports like teachers, coaches, faith-based group connections, community groups, things like that. It can also include like negotiating rent payments and deferring payments. It can involve an arrangement with a landlord to defer rent or pay in installments that could prevent the eviction, right? Renting from acquaintances. So maybe individuals might be able to find informal housing opportunities by renting a room or a unit from someone they know personally, bartering or exchange of services. So I've seen it sometimes when folks have worked in exchange for housing, offering to provide services like housekeeping, childcare, or maintenance in exchange for a place to stay temporarily. Some more formal resources might include things like short-term financial assistance that could assist with the household related to costs while being temporarily accommodated at an alternate location. You may want to also consider various health and social assistance benefits that the person might be eligible to receive with emergency housing placement. Sometimes we'll see this with youth, and I think, and specific financial benefits that might be available through child welfare, transportation assistance to get to a safe location, or potentially they could be diverted to a health facility if there's a serious issue presenting that needs to be addressed, and not appropriate to be in shelter until properly addressed by a healthcare professional. So you want to spend time exploring in the informal before looking at formal options for a couple of reasons. One is that oftentimes formal resources are limited as to how much and how often you can use them. So best to exhaust kind of your informal options before you use the limited formal resource that might be available in your community. And the other is that oftentimes those most significantly barriered are often already ineligible for the formal resources that might be available in your community for a variety of reasons. So you will need to be more creative with informal resources because of the limited conditions attached to them compared to those more formal resources, right? We see that informal resources tend to have fewer conditions for eligibility and things like that than the formal ones. But really, once when you've come up with options, and hopefully not just one option, right? So we want to think about your primary option. And I like to use from military people, they use this term called PACE. So like, what's my primary option? What's my alternate option? What's my contingency option? And then what's my emergency option? So hopefully you come up with options and you rank order them with the person to help them identify which ones are the most actionable and favorable to the least actionable and the least favorable. So start with the ones that are most actionable and favorable and work through the options if needed. Hopefully your first one is the one that works, if it's the most suitable option. So for instance, solution number one might be call friends' place they were staying at last night and mediate the conflict and see what resources the friend feels is needed in order for that person to continue to temporarily stay in their home. Option two could be call mom, who says that she can only have her child stay with them for a night or two as an absolute last resort, but will also need transportation to help them get to their place as it's a bit out of the way. And then you can go so on and so on through options like that. So I know that we're not together, so you can't really raise your hand, but if we were in a group together, I would do this exercise of please raise your hand if your community has the perfect amount or more than enough housing and shelter resources to respond to help those that are in need during their time of housing crisis. I've yet to meet a shelter or a community that felt like they had the perfect amount of housing and shelter resources to meet the needs around them. So this is why diversion becomes really important. We need to make sure we're having the greatest impact possible with the limited resources available. And despite our best efforts, shelter can be traumatic for a lot of people. So no matter how well you run your shelter, and most people prefer to being temporarily housed than being in shelter, let me restart that. Despite running your shelter to the best of your ability, we know that most people would prefer to be in some type of temporary alternative housing accommodation than entering shelter. But we also know too that the longer experiences of being unsheltered or emergency sheltered and the more frequent contacts people have with our shelters are directly linked to poor housing and health outcomes. So if we can prevent them from even having to enter once, we can think about how that directly relates to improved health and housing outcomes for them down the road. So just to clarify, despite our best efforts, this means the more often and the longer someone is involved with our system of care, the worse their outcomes will be. So this is why it's really critical for their well-being to either never know us or know us as briefly as possible. And so staff in shelter can then focus more intensely with those that have to be in shelter to assist them with their own rehousing. But also when we successfully divert someone from shelter, that creates one more bed that's available to accommodate someone who absolutely needs to be there. We can also agree that if someone can be prevented from entering shelter, we will do what's within our power to make sure that occurs. The more, so like, we'll put all of our energy if there's still an opportunity for people to not enter our shelter. So I've heard this from a lot of groups though, especially if you're new to the subject of prevention and diversion, is that folks have shared with me like, oh, I hear the words like prevention and diversion used interchangeably and it kind of creates some confusion. So what's the difference? So I want to just really quickly provide a simple definition that helps clarify the difference between these two things. Prevention really refers to eviction or housing loss prevention and includes any activities that you do with someone before someone has lost the ability to reside at their home, right? So all these are things that help them prevent the loss of their housing, so they're not homeless yet. Versus diversion refers to all those activities that some of them I mentioned earlier in previous slide that occur only after someone has lost their housing, but prior to them entering shelter. So they've already lost their housing. We verified that they are in fact homeless or without housing, but now we're trying to figure out if it makes sense for them to come into shelter, or do they have suitable alternatives still available to them that we can explore that are out in the community. So that's the difference between those two things. When we're talking about diversion, it's really targeted to people who've already lost their housing, as I mentioned, and that can be people who are about to not just enter shelter, but are also those that are potentially at risk of sleeping outside. And we see that with diversion, this has a high impact on our homelessness system of care, depending on the community and how robust their diversion is and their diversion opportunities. We've seen where it can be effective in successfully diverting anywhere from 25 to 60% of people who show up seeking shelter. Whereas homelessness prevention and eviction prevention are two different things. Homelessness prevention is about targeting extremely vulnerable people who are about to lose their housing. So this might be people who had a history of being homeless before they were in housing. So they've had that experience previously, and we know that if they were to lose this housing, they'd be significantly barred in finding new housing. But that's uniquely different than when we talk about eviction prevention. Eviction prevention is not the same as homelessness prevention, right? This intervention would target low-income people who have received an eviction notice, but potentially don't have additional barriers or don't have any history of being homeless. But beyond kind of the eviction notice and economic poverty, there may not be the presence of those other things that you see with the homelessness prevention audience. So, and this is why eviction programs have what we see here on the slide as a low impact on our homelessness system, is because research continues to show that the majority of extremely low income households that are evicted do not become homeless. They do not need help. But investing homelessness specific resources to support this group is not effective in reducing the number of people that are homeless in your community. So eviction prevention resources should be provided, just not from homeless specific funds. Compare those that got the service versus those that didn't when the fund ran out. You would see that there's no difference between, statistically, there's no relevant difference or significant difference between people who did receive eviction prevention dollars and those that didn't when it looked at if they became homeless or not. It doesn't mean that those that were at risk of getting eviction didn't experience real stress and real hardship. It's just for whatever reason, they didn't become homeless. So for the purpose of our training or this webinar, this is why we're really focusing more on diversion exclusively than on prevention, because we see that diversion has the greatest impact on a positive impact on our homelessness system of care. So if you attended our webinar in July on the role of emergency shelters, you may recall me showing this image. This image highlights kind of well that our services in shelters work kind of as part of a system. And so what we're reviewing today, diversion, and secondly, intake, are not standalone services, but rather fit within that continuum that you could offer in your shelter, or if not directly in your shelter, as part of your broader community homelessness response. This image also captures well kind of the sequential order with which we should be using specific services with people in need. So for instance, diversion comes before intake, but these interventions come before others, like triage and assessment or rapid resolution and so on. So while we know that it doesn't always go in this order, this is potentially how we want kind of services to be introduced to people in our system of care in that sequential order. So some misconceptions though about diversion. We've heard people say that like diversion means denying shelter access, right? Some people believe that diversion services are simply a way to deny people access to shelters, leaving them without any type of support. But it's quite the opposite, right? Diversion is about finding safe and stable alternatives to shelter. It involves assessing each person's situation and providing a tailored support, such as mediation with a landlord or family, or financial assistance, or short-term housing. Anybody who's done diversion knows it is not simple, right? It is a very involved process that requires more work than refusing access to shelter or rushing to intake. We also know or heard from people that diversion only provides short-term solutions. So some people may think that diversion is merely a stopgap measure that doesn't offer long-term stability. The reality is that diversion often focuses on immediate crisis resolution, but it also aims to connect individuals and families with resources that can lead to long-term stability. So you may have diverted them from entering into shelter, but wherever they've been diverted to, there needs to be some kind of follow-up that would include connecting them to whatever the missing resource or services that are needed in order for them to be rehoused. Another thing that we've heard from people is anyone can be diverted. It's assumed by some that all individuals seeking shelter can be diverted, when the reality is that diversion is not suitable for everyone. It's most effective for those with some level of existing support network, or for those who, like, a small amount of assistance can prevent their homelessness. People with severe needs or without any safe alternatives may still need shelter. And my personal favorite, diversion is only about finding housing. That's a misconception where the idea is that diversion is solely focused on finding alternative housing options, when the reality is that diversion is a holistic approach that addresses the underlying issues contributing to the housing crisis. So this can include things that I mentioned earlier, like mediation, financial assistance, connecting them to employment or mental health services. So it goes beyond way more than just finding housing, but also trying to address those factors that may have contributed to the loss of their previous housing experience. And so next up, I will pass it over to Amanda who will talk to us a little bit about an example of a diversion aid that they use at home base in Kingston. And then, I mean, for you, I will be your assistant. You tell me when to move through the slides.
All right. Thank you so much, Grant. So thanks everybody for attending today. So here at In From the Cold Emergency Shelter, we are a housing focused shelter. And I can't echo enough of what Grant was saying. It really is up to the staff whether or not we have good diversion within our shelter. It takes time. Emergency shelters don't ask a lot of questions. It's a quick intake and they're in, whereas the diversion does take a bit more time of your staff. But we know that we can have successful diversions. And if we're able to avoid somebody entering the homelessness system, they have a much a higher chance of not ever entering the homelessness system again. So prior to an intake to shelter, we do a prevention and diversion questionnaire as people call or arrive at our door. And so the first thing is asking, are they currently experiencing homelessness? Not everybody trying to access shelter is experiencing homelessness. So the first is to find out whether or not they're homeless. If they've ever accessed a shelter bed before, and how long have they been experiencing homelessness? So we ask these questions because it leads to a conversation. If they're not currently experiencing homelessness, but they're having difficulty with roommates or family, whether or not they've experienced homelessness again, is it a matter of a housing breakdown? Grant, if you want to go to the next slide. So then we want to explore with them kind of where they're coming from, what's worked for them. So where did they sleep last night? You know, was it a family, a friend? Was it an alternative shelter? Was it on the street? That way we're able to try to help mediate. Grant had spoke about it earlier, you know, if they had stayed with friends, but maybe they need to provide some food for their friend to be able to continue to stay there. So those are things we're able to help them so that they don't have to enter the shelter system. So it's what happened that meant you could no longer stay there. So understanding, was it a family breakdown? Was it a relationship breakdown? Was it unsafe? And then do you have family or friends that you may be able to stay with? So maybe they stayed with family last night and it didn't work, but is there another alternative? Do they have friends or family within the community that they're able to stay with? And what is their current financial situation? So we want to know what their current financial situation is because if they have a bank account sitting with a lot of money in it, we don't want them entering the shelter system. If we're able to help them get a motel room for the month, or even a couple nights until we can work with them during daytime hours to try to help better their situation so that they're not having to enter the shelter system. And then, are you receiving supports from other agencies? So this is really important as well, because we need to know who these individuals are connected to. Not that we need to know, but we like to know who they're connected to, who their supports are, so that we can work collaboratively with those supports to best serve that individual. All right, Grant. So as I said, family breakdown, relationship breakdown, we want to find out what are the safety concerns, if any, and have they contacted police? Sometimes we found people wanting to enter the shelter system, they're the ones that are actually the leaseholder and their partner is the abuser and they've left the unit. And so legally they stay in their unit and the police should be removing the accused. So that is another experience that we see coming in, and where diversion can be a great asset to those individuals in maintaining their housing. If it is domestic violence, we have an interval house here in Kingston, and so we would do that referral to Interval House rather than keeping them here, because the proper supports are at Interval House for those individuals leaving domestic violence. From that, we want to determine, have we been able to successfully find an alternative spot for this individual? If they can't, if we haven't been successful, then we ask them to then come to shelter. We document all of it. We document the call, the reason why. So if I've gone off shift and somebody shows up at the door, my shift partner then knows to look for the prevention diversion sheet, and they're able to see whether or not that person has gone through the diversion practices to see if we can help find them an alternative location rather than shelter. So then we determine whether or not they're encouraged to intake, whether or not we have been able to successfully divert them, or whether or not it's been a turn away. In 2003, we had 186 unique individuals come through our shelter door. We had 756 successful diversions. So if we hadn't been able to divert those people successfully, we would have had over 900 individuals staying within our shelter, unique individuals. That is a large number of people that don't need to be entering the homelessness system if they don't need to. So we really focus on that diversion piece, trying to find an alternative prior to them coming into shelter and entering into that homelessness system. Sorry, thanks, Grant.
Thank you, Amanda. And then, and thank you for sharing that example. And I think when we think about diversion too, there's lots of communities that have diversion job aids, and there's some that don't. But I think every time I hear someone talk about diversion in training, it's a reminder too that these job aids, whatever you develop, is not necessarily the only questions you can ask, but they're kind of like guideposts that can help you explore specific themes. And then you might actually find that there's very relevant follow-up questions that you want to ask that that aren't necessarily included in any job aid. So we're just encouraged to kind of to recognize that the job aids that are developed are just that, right? They're aids, they're guideposts, but they don't force or constrict you to limiting to just to those questions if you feel like there's other relevant questions that could be asked to help with your diversion strategy. And so one of the things that I liked, that I again kind of borrowed from Org Code with their permission, was something that Ian developed, was an acronym for diversion, because I knew sometimes when I did diversion in the past, I may work for an organization that had kind of a job aid, but there was other places I worked that didn't. So in the places where it didn't, I printed off kind of this acronym to kind of help guide me and remind me in what am I trying to do in the diversion, right? So this really helped me get on track with my own kind of personal training as I got more comfortable with diversion. So understanding to deepen the conversation, inquire about the housing problem and the most recent housing problem, make sure that you're verifying your understanding of what they had just shared with you and understanding the situation. Of course, we always want to make sure that we're using empathy, we're reasonably exploring alternatives, we select the appropriate alternative, and we focus on safety, implement that alternative, outline the next steps, because there are follow-up steps after diversion is completed. And then we note our activities. And then I see there's a hand up.
Sorry, it's me, Grant. It's
Yeah.
Amanda. So I think also too, it's important to recognize that, when we talk about safety and it's really important for our shelter workers also to have an understanding of the legalities around housing. Sorry, I'm drawing a blank right now, but so around tribunal and things like that, because that's another spot where we're able to divert a lot of individuals coming to shelter, is where they believe that they've been evicted, they've gotten eviction notices, but that actually is not the case, and they're still eligible to be in their unit until tribunal and things like that. So again, part of that diversion piece is understanding some of the legalities around the housing as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. I'm sure anybody that's worked in shelters have had people show up and then they say that they're evicted, and when we kind of dig a little bit deeper, we're like, well, have the locks been changed? Like, has the sheriff come and change lock? No, you can go home, but there's still some follow-up work that we need to kind of address whatever the issue is with your landlord. So that's a great point. I'm glad you brought that up. I'm going to pivot over to Michael for a moment before we move into the topic of shelter admission, and just kind of ask Michael, in your experience, like lots of experience working with youth, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about your journey in that. But I think one is, are there some youth specific things that we need to consider when we're looking at diversion if you're tailoring it specific to supporting transition age youth?
Yeah, thanks. Just off the top, I'd like to say that absolutely everything that's been said so far, I agree with. The only thing where uh, I would change up somewhat is we've had more success as a program working further upstream in the prevention, and diversion ended up being a complement to the prevention work we're doing. But if you're just starting to get into prevention, then I think diversion is a great sort of first step into prevention. But a lot more can be done in prevention. I think you'll see if you get further, far enough upstream, you can really see great results. So just for our experience, we started off with just as a shelter, started offering a youth reconnect program, which is basically where we worked with schools to identify students before they became homeless. We were able to expand that program across the Niagara region, and doing so, we saw about an 80% reduction in our shelter usage. So we went from having a 24-bed shelter that was always full to sitting at a 12-bed shelter that was about half full. And then after running that program for a number of years, we ran into an issue where we just couldn't get to zero in our shelter. We were doing this prevention work, but there was still something there. So that's when we looked around, and that's when shelter diversion. I saw a presentation, and it seemed to be focused where I wanted it focused. And so we started a shelter diversion program in 2019, and it's been phenomenally successful. Also, and like I said, it's an excellent complement to the prevention work we're doing. And so I see shelter diversion as either, the last step in prevention or the first step into shelter, depending on, how you situate it. We run it fairly similarly with we have that questionnaire. Again, I highlight the fact that it really is a conversation. It's not supposed to be a check the box. Like if you just hand it to people and just read it and then fill in notes on it, that won't be effective. It really is just a way to ensure the conversation is directed towards a housing focused conversation as opposed to an intake conversation, which is probably one of the biggest changes. Is because we're shelters, we assume that the end result of our sort of engagement with people will be shelter, and that kind of presupposes what's actually going to happen. And so a big shift working in shelter diversion, one of the sort of the mind shifts that need to occur is we start off with the assumption that people can be housed, and then work back to the point where that isn't an option, as opposed to assuming people aren't housed and that they don't have housing option. It seems like a simple thing, but it can have drastic results and how you do the work. From our side, I could say there are people who will be more successful in diversion than others. If a person has never been in shelter before, they're much more likely to be housed than someone who has previous history of shelter use. Obviously, family and natural supports is critical. So if they have existing social supports that they can draw on, that's incredibly useful and will help with diversion. We also find that people will try to access shelters for reasons other than emergencies. And so, like you said, you brought the great example of people just don't know their legal, what the legality of their eviction is. And so oftentimes, like was brought up, they think they're evicted, and in fact, they're not. And they paid renting and can go back there. Or you'll have people who maybe a boyfriend or girlfriend has moved into the shelter, and they're leaving their apartment in order to come stay at the shelter. So obviously that's not appropriate use of emergency shelter. And so shelter diversion will help limit that kind of activity. Also, if people are outside of the region, sometimes we'll get people calling, they live somewhere else and they're planning to come into Niagara, but they have absolutely no connections, they have no job set up, they have no way to support themselves. Uh, they're just looking to stay at the shelter. We'll then say that that would be an appropriate use of our shelter. So that would be a diversion. When we look at who's successful, it really is the majority of people do go back to family. Family and friends is the number one place that we divert to. Key to this is a flex fund, which was also brought up. That's just being able to have some money to help with, if it's a bus ticket, or some financial transaction that we need in order to help the person get to the place. So maybe they're in the shelters in the city and they live in a rural community which surrounds the city. Normally they couldn't get there, and so they're using the shelter because they can't actually get home. They have a place to go, but they can't get there. So maybe a bus ticket or even a taxi is appropriate, and that's a very successful diversion. When we look at the people who are successful, if you're first time, I've never used shelter before, we're seeing about a 70% success rate. If you have previous experience of homelessness, we're seeing about a 35% success rate. Overall, we're seeing about a 50% success rate. And this has been after running it. The numbers have gotten better as we've gotten more familiar with diversion. When we first started out, I think our success rate was sitting at about 35%, which was still significant, which then takes pressure off the shelter and allows shelter to be truly housing focused. So I also think that shelter diversion is also a great way to sort of move into a housing focused shelter. If you're looking to make that full change, then I think shelter diversion is perfect for that kind of work. And currently in our shelter, we're seeing average lengths of stay 14 days, and our success to shelter within those 14 days is 50 to 60% of people in our shelter are moving into housing. But again, we need to change what we think about when we think about housing. And family and friends are the largest place where people go to, and that is our most successful housing. And if you think about it, the largest provider, and especially for youth, but I think reasonably for adults as well, the largest provider of affordable housing in North America is family and friends. Most people, if they run into a housing crisis, rely on family and friends. They move in, they stay on the couch, they move back into their old childhood home. This is quite normal. And that's why we don't see massive rates of homelessness, is because people rely on social supports. And so the group that's really at risk, and the group that largely will find you won't be able to divert in this way, and is people who have impaired social connection. So you can see if someone moves from out of town to your town and knows no one, they don't have a social network, they'll likely be in your shelter for extremely long periods of time. If someone is sort of outside of the norms of society, you can see that that could also reduce their social support. And so again, creates a longer period of homelessness. And so that's why we really do want to focus on increasing the social side of housing. Housing is more than just four walls and a roof. It really is about people. And until the system starts to realize that housing is actually about creating home, and home is people, we're really kind of handcuffing ourselves. We'll never really be able to make a real indent into homelessness. On the youth specific side, the thing that's critical again is really that family connection. Youth are obviously closer. It's much more a norm for young people to be living with family, so there's less of a stigma about moving home. But that's really the main piece. That's the difference between youth and adults, I've found, is really to some degree, family may be easier to identify, and their housing might be, they're more used to being there. So there's less stigma on that. But that's really the biggest change between youth and adults, as far as I've been able to tell.
Great. Thanks, Mike. And I think like I appreciate you mentioning, right, like that piece around like the biggest source of diversion opportunity is through our social connections. And I like that you said, like, let's start with that they can be housed and work through it, the options, versus starting with the assumption that they can't, right? It really shifts the perspective around how individual workers will approach that engagement with each person that shows up seeking shelter.
Yeah, and just on that point, so we had a new shelter diversion worker start, and we had, and that is a huge piece of what we do. We track quite a bit of data points for all of our programs, and I review it monthly. And so we had a new worker start, and I noticed that we had a drop off in our in the number of successful diversions we had in that person's first month. And so we took, we do a little reflection exercise about, what do you think is going on? Was there something different? And he came back and he said, the difference was I started with the assumption that the person was going to be coming into shelter. And when I changed that and I started from a place of you can be housed and shelter is the last outcome as opposed to the first outcome, that changed it, and he was able to achieve the rates that we were used to achieving.
That's great. That's great too. And I'm glad that you kind of, like, you mentioned that you use data to kind of and review it to kind of provide the opportunity for some insights as to where to follow up when we're seeing kind of different results than what we're expecting. I'm cognizant of the time, so I'm going to move through because I want to make sure that we get some questions that can be answered by the panelists. I do want to kind of just move over then to talk about shelter admission really quickly, when and how, right? So when is when shelter diversion has proven to be unsuccessful, and the only safe option for that individual or family is to enter the shelter. But I put here that it's important to note that if you've done really, really good work and exhaustive work in exploring diversion alternatives, you should not see shelter admission as a failure, that you didn't provide good diversion, but rather it's you've determined that shelter admission is the appropriate service that's needed for that circumstance or that situation. When we're talking about shelter admission, just some considerations around how you do that, right? So booking into shelter is explained to the individual. You're emphasizing its dual purpose, right? For admission, it's the dual purpose is about completing essential administrative activities and making sure that we're setting them up safely. And I think that it's important to note too that trust can really be enhanced through this early part when you first connect with someone in the orientation of assurances of like their confidentiality, and reminding them that their stories remain theirs to share and not ours. So you can just see kind of some of the itemized things there that you want to consider when you're doing an overview of the expectations in the shelter. And so that can include, like, really simply, like having a script for an introduction that's developed by your staff to reference. And that really kind of helps, I think, I know like not everybody loves scripts, but I think it helps with the idea of developing consistency around what people can expect or what they can expect to hear when they enter that space. And it's important that they feel kind of comfortable and informed during their stay right there. So if they have any points during your introduction in that script, you encourage that they ask their questions, or if they need assistance, to not hesitate to reach out. We also want to make sure that before you begin kind of that intake or admission process, if you have the capacity to do this in your shelter, is to ask them to say if there's a specific staff member you'd prefer for them to provide the orientation. This could be, because of like gender, age, cultural background, or language spoken. So it's really about trying to create that comfort for them from the start. You do want to talk about something like during the orientation that you're going to cover a bunch of aspects of their stay, including like really simple things, but important things like building entry and exit, what assigned floor they're in and what bed is theirs, providing bedding, bathroom facilities, where they're located, hygiene services, what the staff availability looks like, storage options if that's needed, where there's privacy, what they can expect as far as like common sounds, if there's designated smoking areas, what the meal times are, that there's staff are like there's safety reminders that go into that. But also if your shelter offers harm reduction supplies, where and how you can access them, and review with them important emergency procedures. So this orientation, typically, if I'm borrowing from the example that was provided by the Calgary drop-in, should take about 30 minutes max, that you'll let them know that it takes about that time, but obviously you're trying to do it at a pace that suits them, and a reminder to just be able to ask questions along the way. So your orientation can include things like maybe even physically showing as examples on the pictures on the side there of the physical layout. So like not just what the shelter looks like in the different floors, but where the shelter is located in the city and what are things nearby. Yeah, location of meal, showers, laundry I mentioned. You want to probably assign a sleep place, and if it's their first time in shelter, you want it to kind of be a location that's near a staff office, just because there could be a lot of stress and uncertainty in someone's first night or early stay and first time in a shelter. And if there's more than one floor for your shelter, you do really want to take the time to let them know what each floor entails and what they have access to. Any emergency procedures you want to make sure that they're aware of, and that they understand the clear exit paths and what the muster point is for that emergency exit. And then potentially just a very high level introduction to services. So what's available on site if your shelter has things like rehousing support or health services and things like that. And so you can see here too, is that it's really important to kind of go over rights and guidelines. And I know that for low barrier shelters, it's really, really critical to try and minimize the amount of rules. So trying to fit it onto one page, and that most of those rules or expectations mostly relate to safety and security and respect. But expectations are really critical. They're the backbone of communal settings, right? So you do want to have a candid conversation with every guest, regardless of their circumstance, that they share the same fundamental responsibilities as every other guest that's in there. It's in this conversation where you want to encourage kind of questions, and make sure that they're clear around the expectations and what the rights and responsibilities are while they're there. You want to be clear about things too, like information and resource connection, but you can do that about highlighting kind of what's available internally, but also externally through things like I've seen in shelters where they put posters, or some are starting to do more like monitors, where it has like scrolling through different screens of pieces of information, just to plant the seed with people around like, hey, if you need help looking for housing, go to this floor to talk to the housing team. Stuff like that. So really want to have housing focused messages on screens or posters in common spaces, and relevant information that will help them with their stay while they're there. And then obviously before you complete the orientation with the shelter guest too, you want to make sure that you're documenting everything appropriately with the appropriate consent to service. And then you can move into completing the intake. I know that was really quick around the intake. We'll probably spend a little bit more time on it in the next webinar, but I'm going to unshare my screen for a moment. And I just want to go to Chantel and see, I have some preset questions that I can ask our presenters, but if there's any questions from the audience, we can maybe pull them up now.
Yeah, so I'm not seeing any questions in the Q&A right now. If people are having issues with the mute button, which I think may be a setting issue that Grant will rectify for the next webinar, please feel free to put questions in the chat or in the Q&A, wherever you're most comfortable.
I can see that there's one question from an anonymous attendee that says, please explain how diverting to family and friends is different than couch surfing and hidden homelessness. In our community, overcrowding is a huge concern. Maybe I'll pitch this to Mike.
Yeah, and it's a good question, and it really does come down to who do we consider homeless. And when we looked at how the majority of the population where people live, people generally live at home with, especially for youth, live with family. Over something like 70% of people under the age of 25 still live at home in Canada. So it's very normal for people to be living at home, and that's why we focus on that. I would say that couch surfing is also, it's better to be couch surfing with support than staying in shelter. We found that any time spent in shelter really increased the risk that you will have re-entry into shelter, and that there's also increased risk that you'll become more system involved. And so we think the support of staying with a friend is always better than staying in a shelter, even that means staying on the couch. The key is that we make sure we offer the support to you. We just don't leave you on the couch.
Amanda, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I was just gonna say too, I think the other piece too is in today with the cost of living and no increase to social assistance and pensions, we're seeing a lot more multi-generational families having to live together. So we are housing grandparents with their kids because that's what is affordable for people. And so if we can divert them to stay with family, I mean, that is, as Mike said, a much better option than them having to come into the shelter system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's a great question too, because it hits on this point a bit around saying diversion from shelter does not mean that that person is no longer homeless. They just haven't entered your shelter. And so this is where you could think, okay, there was a successful diversion, potentially with like a permanent reunification with friends or family, or it could be something that's still very precarious and temporary that feels like couch surfing or whatever it might be. But you've successfully diverted them from shelter, but there's still additional work to be done. So this is where it's kind of saying, okay, we've diverted from shelter, but what does the next step look for who can start to follow up with that person from that diverted location to help them with their rehousing journey? It just means that they haven't entered shelter. I think that there was a hand up from Corinna, but it's since gone down. I just want to make sure, Corinna, like you still want to ask a question? I believe you're unmuted now, Corinna, if you're able to ask your question. Not sure what's going on. Okay, well, while we're figuring that out with Corinna, I'm going to ask some preset questions that I have. And this is for both Mike and Amanda. Are we still going to try diversion if the person is unwell, drunk, or high at the time of the diversion attempt?
So I don't mind speaking to that, Grant. So no. If somebody, we would assess. If somebody is under the influence and we have a rapport with that individual and we know that they're still able to make sound decisions for themselves, then we would ask some of those diversion questions. If we were unfamiliar with that individual and they presented under the influence, we would not be doing diversion that night, but in the morning, we would still do that diversion piece to see if there's an alternative for them. If somebody is extremely intoxicated, there also is the risk of them being in shelter where we're not a medical facility. And so quite often if they're under the influence and unable to speak for themselves, to the point where they're falling down and things like that, we'll refer them to detox.
Okay, great. Michael?
100%, exactly. That's exactly what we do, word for word.
Okay. Yeah, and I know different shelters have different answers for that, especially too when you think about if your shelter leans a little bit more towards sobriety requirements or not, or if it's more behavior based, which it sounds to like Amanda, like it sounds like you're adopting more of a behavior based than just hard and fast, no diversion if you're under the influence, but rather like what am I observing for what the person's ability is to participate in this diversion. And what I also like too is to hear it may not be possible but right now, but we can circle back to it when potentially you do have greater ability to answer some of these questions. So
Absolutely, because we still want to be able to determine whether or not there is a better suitable place for that individual rather than in shelter.
right. So this kind of, I'm gonna guess that there's a similar answer to this, but what if it's late at night when the person is looking for service? Do you still do diversion? So let's say it's like 2 a.m.
So the answer is going to be very similar. No, we're not going to do diversion at 2 a.m. because we're not going to call your aunt or your friend at 2 a.m. to see if you can come to their couch. We would give you a bed for the night and have a meeting in the morning to discuss those diversion options.
Yeah, we're the same. We actually, for success, we rank success 48 hours. So if you come in, because we don't have 24-hour diversion coverage. So if you come in Friday evening, you won't be able to speak with our diversion worker until Monday. And so we track successful, if you're successfully diverted within 40 business hours.
This is something also I've also heard from, especially like shelter frontline, like direct service staff in shelter might say, if we're already really busy in the day-to-day activities of the shelter, how are we supposed to work diversion into our day?
So as I said, it does take a bit more time from staff, absolutely. But as we explained to them, if you put the time in the beginning, it's actually less time needed in the future. So it's one less individual, that we're needing to serve every need and meet every need for. So it does take a bit of time, but in the long run, it actually saves them time. It also, I guess, for our staff, our emphasis is if you don't do diversion and you're just giving beds to everybody, then what do we do with that person that really can't be diverted anywhere and needs that bed if we're full? And so that's the other piece of that diversion, is not, it's to make sure that we're able to assist everybody.
Yeah, I'm a big proponent of a dedicated diversion. That's how we run it. And other groups that I've worked with, I found the best results is when you have a dedicated person. I think the shelter diversion worker should be one of your most experienced staff. This shouldn't be someone who's just out of school, because the safe and appropriate is so important, and we want to make sure we have someone who's experienced in being able to understand the nuances when you're talking to somebody about. Because sometimes people may say, "Oh no, I can go back there," and the worker will be like, "Actually, that's not. We don't feel that would be safe." As opposed to someone with maybe less experience, like, "Oh, that's great, okay, check that box." But if you do roll it through the shelter, it is a lot more work for individual staff. We have we've designed. We have what we call a full tool, which is very similar to what was described earlier with the questions. But we also have what we call a mini tool, which is it's more like a screener that when the dedicated diversion worker isn't on, that staff, and so that helps. It's much less successful for us. So I really do think for biggest bang for buck would be to try and get the at least one full-time dedicated worker for diversion.
Yeah, I've kind of seen shelters kind of do dedicated workers or they cross-train everybody, and so yeah, I think
it depends on your municipality too and your funding and so whether or not you're able to have funding for a prevention diversion worker within your shelter. Here in Kingston, we have 3 shelters. Only one of our shelters have prevention diversion in them. And it's just based on funding. We need the shelter workers in there to support. And so we're unable to designate diversion workers within shelters here for that reason. So we train all of our staff, but we do have prevention diversion workers that would do follow up with people that are intaked. But that'll go with your next webinar about the outflow.
Mhm. Yeah, and so I want to hit on something too that kind of made me think of this next question, Mike, when you're talking about a characteristic that you're looking for in a diversion worker is to maybe one of your more experienced staff. Are there other specific characteristics or qualities that you're looking for in someone that make for a really great diversion worker?
Yeah, I mean, like like all staff, I think it's the ability to have that like authentic conversations with people, the non-judgmental, which really, I mean, it's kind of like cliche that we say these things, but there truly is a non-judgmental, and it goes back to that. Do we really believe that people are housable? Which I found in the work that I've done with other groups, that's a real big barrier. There's a you think that we sort of talk about the line that, oh yeah, no, we believe everybody's housable, but deep down inside we sort of decided that certain people, well, too much of this or too much of that, and it really is a belief. So the person who's just fully invested and really bought into the idea of the housing first model and the housing focus model, and honestly believes in people, they'll be the most successful at it.
Anything that you would add to that, Amanda?
No, I would agree wholeheartedly. It does take somebody also with a bit more experience. As Michael was saying earlier, you don't want somebody fresh out of college. This is gonna sound cold, but it's not. You can't have a bleeding heart when you're working in the prevention diversion role, because it really is, like Mike said, having those hard conversations with people about what their alternatives are and that kind of thing. So.
Yeah, it sounds too like you need someone with like that's really creative in their problem solving, but also potentially like supportive, compassionate, but still like with direction and some what I call it, kind assertiveness.
That's right.
I'm going to circle back to Corinna just to see if we were able to figure out the unmute situation. I see her hand still up. Perhaps not. Oh, hand came down. Okay. Well, we're just about at the time. So if there's no new questions coming through, I see too that Chantel added the diversion learnings link, making the shift, 2 years of shelter diversion that was shared by Mike Lethby. That's in the chat. You both kind of, well, one, Amanda, we kind of used your tool as a community example. I guess I'm wondering from our speakers, are you comfortable with when we send out the recording and the slides from today's, if you're comfortable with also sharing, I could circulate your diversion tools that you use with staff if people are looking to adopt something similar internally at their shelter?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. One last thing. I mentioned this in previous sessions. Before we wrap up, please, if you really urge shelter operators that are a part of the network to get involved in a research and evaluation study that we're doing with the University of Calgary in partnership with Calgary Drop-In and Org Code. It is about housing focused shelter transformation, kind of what are the barriers, the opportunities, the resources needed for shelters to make this transformation. It is being led by Dr. Katrina Mullaney from the University of Calgary. And she really wants to hear from shelter operators around like, what needs to exist in order for shelters to feel like they're adequately supported to kind of make this change. So I just put her email directly in the chat. I really encourage folks to just contact her directly if you're interested in doing kind of a short survey with her. I believe it takes no longer than 10 to 15 minutes. It's available to complete online. And your feedback is really, really helpful for us to know kind of where shelters are at and what needs they have in order to kind of do this change work. I also want to thank Amanda and Mike for participating and being presenters with me today. I want to thank Chantel Perry from Built for Zero Canada for providing some backbone administrative support today and helping with the preparation of today's event. And I also want to thank all of you for attending. Please contact me directly in between webinars if there's things that you feel like you're struggling with or want some guidance or direction on as far as work in your shelter. I can be reached at grant@transformshelter.ca. But also, if you are going to be at the upcoming national conference in Ottawa at the end of October, please look for me at the CSTN booth. Introduce yourself. I'd love to put faces to names and kind of get more familiar with the members. And we'll also be hosting an Ask Me Anything session on the afternoon of the first day, everything related to CSTN and shelters. Please come out and join us, ask your burning questions, anything related to shelter operations. So with that, thank you again, everybody. Have a wonderful day. All this stuff will be circulated to the attendees in about less than a week's time. You should get something in your inbox. And hopefully I'll see you next month. All the best. Bye for now.